This alien revealed to me a hidden truth about Jesus that humanity is not ready to hear. And before you dismiss this claim as absurd, I need you to understand something. What you are about to discover will shake every certainty you have about Christianity, about faith, and about what really happened 2,000 years ago. Before we dive deeper, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of tea, or just some water, and sit back as we begin this journey together. But I need you to listen to the end, because this truth, as disturbing as it may be, can free you from one of the greatest distortions in human history. If you've ever felt like something doesn't make sense in traditional Christianity, if you've ever questioned contradictions no one can explain, this story will touch on wounds that religion prefers to keep hidden. Now, let me tell you what happened to Edward Thorne, that early morning that would change everything. The lamplight cast long shadows across the stacks of manuscripts scattered across Edward Thorne's desk. It was 2:00 inches the morning on a frigid Tuesday in Oregon, and he was exactly where he'd spent most of his nights for the past 5 years, immersed in ancient texts, unearthing things that perhaps should have stayed buried. At 60, with tousled gray hair and reading glasses sliding down his nose, Edward was the image of a man who had gone too far. A former religious studies professor, now an independent researcher since his divorce. His ex-wife, Martha, had said he was obsessed, that he was dabbling in dangerous things, that some doors shouldn't be opened. He didn't listen. And now, alone in that isolated house in the Oregon woods, Edward sometimes wondered if she was wrong. That night, he was reviewing notes he'd made months ago, comparisons between Aramaic and Greek texts, and modern translations, patterns. He'd been identifying contradictions no one in academia wanted to discuss, changes that seemed intentional. Someone had changed things, removed parts, toned down concepts that were too radical. And the more Edward dug, the clearer it became that these weren't innocent mistakes. It was deliberate. Edward circled a sentence in his notebook, his hand shaking slightly. Not from the cold, from something he didn't want to name. Fear. Because if he was right about what he discovered, it meant that the entire structure of Christianity, billions of believers, thousands of churches, unimaginable fortunes, was built on something that had been intentionally distorted. And people who discovered these things, well, history was not kind to them. Edward thought of colleagues who lost their jobs for asking the wrong questions. Researchers who were publicly discredited, people who simply disappeared from academia after publishing overly controversial work. He himself had lost everything: career, marriage, reputation, all because he couldn't stop asking questions. Maybe I should stop, he muttered to himself, staring at the mountain of manuscripts. Maybe I've gone too far. But even as he spoke, he knew he wouldn't stop. He couldn't. He had crossed the point of no return. That's when he heard the noise. A low, deep sound coming from the backyard, like something heavy landing. Not an impact. Something controlled, deliberate. Edward stopped completely, his pen suspended in midair. The silence that followed was oppressive. He lived alone, a secluded property, no neighbors within 2 miles. He'd chosen this place precisely to get away from everything, everyone. But now, in the early morning silence, Edward wondered if isolation had been a good idea. Seconds passed. No other sound. Just an animal, he whispered, trying to convince himself. Deer or... The sound came again. Metallic this time. Definitely not an animal. Edward's heart raced. He stood slowly, every muscle tense. Part of him, the rational part, said to ignore it. Get back to the manuscripts. It was just the wind, or a falling branch, or... But another part, the part I had learned to listen to after years of studying texts about persecution and silencing. That part said something was wrong. Very wrong. He walked to the office window, moving slowly, trying not to make a sound. He gently parted the curtain with trembling fingers and looked out. The backyard was shrouded in shadow. Tall trees blocked most of the moonlight. Everything seemed normal at first glance, but then he saw a light, dim, bluish, pulsing gently near the shed. It wasn't natural light. It wasn't a flashlight or a car headlight. It was something completely different. Edward felt a chill run down his spine. His breathing became shallow. "No," he whispered. "This can't be happening." Because in the back of his mind, a paranoid voice, a voice that had been growing louder over the past few months, whispered something terrible. "You went too far. You discovered things you shouldn't have discovered. And now they've come for you." Edward recoiled from the window, his heart racing. He was being ridiculous, paranoid. Years of solitude and obsession were making him see threats where none existed. It was just something common. It had to be. But then the light pulsed brighter and Edward saw movement. Something moving near the shed. Something that definitely wasn't a deer or a raccoon. His mouth went dry. Part of him wanted to run, lock all the doors, pick up the phone, and call who? The police. And tell them that there was a strange light in the backyard and he was scared because he'd spent years questioning religious texts. But he couldn't just ignore it. I needed to know. Even though every fiber of his being screamed that it was a bad idea. Edward walked to the back door, each step seeming to take forever. His hands trembled as he unlocked the lock. The metallic click sounded absurdly loud in the silence. He opened the door slowly. The chilly early morning air hit him like a solid wall, making him shiver. He was wearing only sweatpants and a t-shirt, completely unprepared for the Oregon cold. But the physical cold was nothing compared to the cold in my stomach. Edward stepped out onto the wooden porch. He stood there, his eyes straining to penetrate the darkness, searching for that bluish light. It was louder now, and there was sound, a low vibration in the air, like machinery. But what kind of machinery made that sound? "Hello," he called, hating how weak and scared his voice sounded. "If anyone's there, I've already called the police." Lie, but maybe it would work. No answer, just that constant vibration. Edward walked down the steps, the grass icy and wet beneath his bare feet. Each step brought him closer to that light, closer to something his brain refused to process. He turned the corner of the shed, and your world stopped. There was a structure there, not large, maybe the size of a small car, but completely impossible. Curved, smooth, with a surface that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. It pulsed with a bluish glow from within, like a living organism. Edward staggered back, mouth open, unable to form words. No, not that. And then the structure began to open up. Part of the surface slid away, creating a dark opening. And from within this darkness, something began to emerge. A figure, humanoid, but completely wrong, distorted proportions. Movements no human could make. Absolute terror washed over Edward. His legs refused to move. He wanted to run, scream, do anything. But he was paralyzed, watching the thing tear itself completely out of the impossible structure. And when the figure turned toward him, Edward saw the eyes big, dark, empty of any humanity. His mind collapsed. Everything he knew about reality, about what was possible, simply crumbled. "Please," he whispered, not knowing exactly what he was asking for. "Please don't." And then the voice came. Not through his ears, straight into his head. Cold, calculated, inescapable. Edward Thorne. He nearly vomited from sheer terror. "You asked a lot of questions. You discovered a lot of things. Things that shouldn't have been discovered." Edward's knees gave way. He fell to the wet grass, shaking uncontrollably. I won't tell anyone," he begged, tears streaming down his face. "I swear I'll forget everything. I'll burn all the manuscripts. Do you think I came here to silence you?" There was something in the tone, not exactly emotion, but something that made Edward hesitate. The creature stepped forward. In the dim moonlight, Edward saw grayish skin with a subtle sheen, long fingers, a head larger than human, definitely not human. "You have uncovered truths that have been buried for 2,000 years. Truths about intentional distortions, about inverted messages, about how they used one man's death to create a mental prison that lasts for millennia." Edward looked at the creature, confusion mixing with terror. "I have not come to silence you, Edward. I have come because you are ready. Ready to hear the whole truth, the truth that humanity is not ready to accept." The creature tilted its head, studying him with those impossible eyes. "But I must warn you, once you know there is no undoing, once you see how deep the distortion is, how deliberate the manipulation, You will never be the same again." Edward breathed in short sobs, still shaking. His mind struggled to process. Was this real? Was it really happening? "So I ask you, student of lost truths, do you want to know? Do you want me to show you what really happened? What did Jesus really teach? And what did they do with that message afterward?" Edward looked into those alien eyes at that impossible creature standing in his backyard, and he realized that despite the terror, despite the paralyzing fear, he needed to know, even if it destroyed him. Edward remained on his knees in the wet grass, his body trembling with both cold and terror. The creature stood motionless a few feet away, its enormous dark eyes fixed on him with an intensity that seemed to pierce straight to his soul. He tried to speak, but his throat was completely blocked. Thoughts clashed in his mind in absolute chaos. This couldn't be happening. Things like this didn't exist. They weren't real, but it was there, solid, impossible to deny. "You're in shock," the voice echoed inside his head. "It's understandable. Your species isn't used to encounters like this." Edward finally found his voice, but it came out as a strangled whisper. "What? What do you want from me? I told you. I came to give you answers. But first, you need to understand why you're here. Why you, specifically." The creature made a subtle gesture with one long hand, and Edward felt something strange. The vibration in the air shifted. The paralyzing fear that had gripped him began to lessen slightly. Not disappear, but become manageable. "You're not in danger, Edward. Not from me. But your mind is going into survival mode. This will make our conversation difficult." Edward blinked several times, trying to process. Had the being calmed him somehow, manipulated his emotions? This realization brought a new wave of fear. "Are you controlling my mind?" he asked, his voice shaking. "No, just reducing panic response so you can think clearly. You still have full control of yourself. You can get up and run if you want, but you're not going to do that, are you?" Edward realized it was true. Despite the terror, despite everything screaming that this was impossible and dangerous, he didn't want to run away. "I wanted answers. I had spent 5 years searching, 5 years that cost me everything." Slowly on shaky legs, Edward stood. The wet grass had soaked his pants. The early morning chill made him shiver, but he remained standing, staring at the impossible creature. "Why me?" he asked finally. "If you have these answers, why come to some failed professor in the middle of nowhere?" Failed? There was something in the tone of the mental voice that seemed questioning. "Is that how you see yourself?" Edward gave a bitter, humorless laugh. "I lost everything. My career, my marriage, my reputation, all because I couldn't stop asking questions no one wanted to hear." He pointed vaguely to the house behind him. "Now I spend my nights alone, surrounded by manuscripts that prove that everything I taught for 20 years was incomplete, distorted, and I can't do anything with this information because no one will listen to me. So yes, I would say I'm a failure. What if I told you that losing everything was necessary, that you needed to be removed from the system so you could see clearly?" Edward frowned. "What are you talking about? When you were a professor, part of an academic institution, you had what do you call conflicts of interest, reputation to protect, colleagues to not offend, limits on what you could question publicly." The creature took a step closer, and Edward instinctively recoiled, but did not flee. "Only when you lost all that, when you had nothing left to protect, nothing left to lose, were you able to truly see, to ask deeper questions, to follow evidence wherever it led, without fear of consequences." Edward felt something tighten in his chest. It was true. When he was still a professor, he had constantly censored himself. He softened his findings. He avoided overly controversial conclusions. It was only later, after he lost everything, that he finally stopped holding back. "Martha was right then," he murmured. "I was obsessed. I let it destroy my life." Or you finally prioritized truth over comfort, over social approval, over a marriage that was based on a version of you that was no longer real. The words cut deep. Edward thought of Martha, the last years of their marriage, the constant arguments. She'd begged him to stop. She'd said she was scared, that he was changing, that he was becoming someone she didn't recognize. And she was right. He had changed because he had seen things he couldn't undo. She said. I was messing with dangerous things, Edward said quietly. That some truths shouldn't be discovered, that I'd get into trouble. And you believed her? Sometimes, Edward admitted, especially at night, when I was alone with manuscripts and suddenly realized how great the distortion was, how many people had a vested interest in keeping the truth buried. He looked straight into those alien eyes. I was afraid that if I actually discovered something significant, if I proved that the message was intentionally distorted, someone would come and silence me. And even with that fear, you continued. I couldn't stop, Edward said, and there was frustration in his voice now. Even though I wanted to, even though I knew I was destroying my life, I saw the patterns. I saw the changes. I saw how the original message was too radical, too powerful, too dangerous for the power structures. He pointed to the house again. I have 3 notebooks full of evidence, line-by-line comparisons, words that were changed in translations, concepts that were softened, entire teachings that were removed from canonical texts, but preserved in apocryphal gospels. Edward's voice grew louder, more urgent. I can prove there was intentional distortion. I can prove the original message was fundamentally different, but I can't prove why. I can't prove who did it. I can't prove what the purpose was. He felt tears burn his eyes. And this ignorance consumes me, because without understanding why, without understanding the motivation behind the distortion, all I have are pieces, fragments, evidence, without a complete narrative. And that's exactly why I'm here, Edward. The creature came closer, and this time, Edward didn't back away. You've done the work. You've identified the contradictions. You've mapped the shifts. You're inches from the complete truth, but you can't take the final step because you lack context. You lack understanding of the larger forces at play. Edward felt his heart race again, but not from fear, from anticipation. Will you give me that context? I will show you everything, but I need you to understand what you discover goes beyond theological distortions. It will reveal systematic manipulation that has lasted 2 millennia. And once you see this, once you fully understand it, you will carry a weight that few humans carry. What weight? The weight of knowing the truth that billions deny. The weight of seeing the mental prison that keeps humanity trapped. The weight of understanding that the world's most powerful religious structures were built on the intentional inversion of the original message. The creature tilted its head. It's a weight that has destroyed men before you. A weight that has driven some to madness, others to suicide, because once you see it, you can't undo it. And living in a world where everyone around you believes lies, while you know the truth, that can be unbearable. Edward was silent for a long moment. He thought about the last 5 years, the loneliness, the obsession, the cost of seeking truth, and he realized he was already paying that price. I was already living in isolation because I could no longer pretend I didn't see what I saw. I already carry that weight, he said finally. I've already lost everything because of this. The only difference is that now I have a chance to truly understand, to have complete answers instead of fragments. He straightened his shoulders, trying to look braver than he felt. So tell me, show me, what do you know about Jesus? What did they do with his message? Why did they distort it? Are you sure, Edward? Once we start, there's no going back. I am sure. The creature watched him in silence for what seemed like an eternity, and then, very well. But not here. Not in the cold of the early morning where you are shivering and distracted. Come in, go back to your office, to your manuscripts, and there I will show you exactly what happened 2,000 years ago. Edward hesitated for only a second. Then he nodded. He turned and began walking back toward the house, his soaked feet leaving marks in the grass. The creature followed him silently, its fluid, unnatural movements making Edward's skin crawl. As he climbed the porch steps, Edward briefly wondered if he was making the biggest mistake of his life, or if he was about to finally find the answers he had been searching for so long. In any case, there was no turning back. Edward entered the house, the warmth inside a stark contrast to the early morning chill. His wet feet left marks on the hardwood floor as he walked back to the office, acutely aware of the presence following him. The creature entered behind him. Edward heard the door close softly, though he didn't see the being touch it. When he reached the office, Edward stopped in the middle of the room, suddenly acutely aware of how absurd this was. There was an alien creature in his house. In his house, and he just invited it in. "This isn't happening," he muttered, pressing his palms against his eyes. "I'm having a nervous breakdown. Extreme stress. Years of isolation have finally broken me, and now I'm hallucinating." "You're not hallucinating, Edward, but how can I be sure?" He turned abruptly to face the creature, who was now standing near the bookshelf, eyeing the volumes with what appeared to be curiosity. "How do I know this is real, and not just my mind creating explanations for questions I can't answer on my own?" "Touch your pants. They're wet from the grass. Feel your feet. They're cold. Look at your desk. The manuscripts are exactly as you left them before you left." Edward did just that. His pants were soaked. His feet were numb from the cold. And the manuscripts? He approached the table, looking at the scattered pages, his notes in red pen, the colored highlighters, everything exactly as it was. "Hallucinations can be very convincing," he said, but his voice wasn't so sure anymore. "I've read about that. People under extreme stress can create entire realities that seem completely solid. It's true. But you know this isn't a hallucination, Edward. You feel it. There's a difference between reality and illusion." Even when illusion is convincing, Edward slumped into the chair at the desk. His hands were shaking, not just from the cold now, but from everything. From the impossibility, from the fear, from the excitement. "So, you're really from another planet, from another world? Try." The simplicity of the answer somehow made it all the more real. There was no dramatic elaboration. There was no attempt to convince, just direct confirmation. Edward ran his hands through his hair, trying to process. "And you traveled how far?" "Light years to come here to me. Distance is not relevant now. What matters is why I am here." "To give me answers about Jesus," Edward said, still barely believing he was having this conversation. "About distortions in religious texts. Not just about distortions, Edward. About why they were made. About who benefited. About how a message of liberation was transformed into a tool of control." Edward leaned forward, elbows on the table. "But why would you know that? Why would an alien species have information about Jesus Christ, about Christianity?" There was a challenge in his voice now. Part of his academic training resurfacing the need to question sources to check credibility because we observe. Observe. Observe what? Your planet, your species. We've been watching for a long time, millennia, in fact. Edward felt a chill run down his spine. "Are you watching us? Why?" "Advanced civilizations always watch emerging civilizations, especially at critical junctures of development. And Earth has been at a critical juncture for a long time." The creature moved closer, those enormous eyes fixed on Edward with piercing intensity. "We were watching when Jesus walked the earth. We saw what he taught. We saw how people responded. And we saw what happened afterward. How his message was systematically altered, distorted, and inverted to serve purposes that were exactly the opposite of what he intended." Edward felt his breath quicken. You saw Jesus. You witnessed this. Not in the way you imagine. We did not walk among you then. But we observed. We recorded. We witnessed. So you have what? Recordings. Historical records. Edward's mind raced with possibilities. "Can you prove what you're saying?" "I can show you, but not in the way academic evidence works. I can't give you physical documents that you can present to your peers. What I can do is show you through direct connection." Edward frowned. "Direct connection? What does that mean?" "It means I can share memories, images, insights, directly from my consciousness to yours. You won't just hear about what happened. You'll see it. You'll feel it. You'll understand it on a level that words could never convey." Alarm bells went off in Edward's mind. "You want to get inside my head? Mess with my mind? Don't mess with it. Share it. It's a crucial difference. You'll remain conscious and in control at all times. You can break the connection at any moment simply by thinking about it. But without that connection, words alone won't be enough to make you fully understand." Edward stood up abruptly, pacing back and forth between the bookshelves. His academic mind struggled with this. "You're asking me to trust something I can't verify. To accept information I can't validate through traditional methods. How do I know what you're showing me is real? How do I know it's not just manipulation, implanting false memories? You don't know. Not with absolute certainty. Just as you're not absolutely certain that this conversation is actually happening and isn't an elaborate hallucination. Edward stopped walking, looking at the creature. At some point, Edward, you have to make a choice. You can continue to demand evidence that meets academic standards, standards that by definition cannot validate experiments outside of normal parameters. Or you can take the leap. You can trust the intuition that has guided you this far. You can accept that some truths don't fit within conventional methodologies, but that goes against everything I've been taught, Edward said, frustration clear in his voice. My entire career has been based on verifiable evidence, on rigorous methodology, on healthy skepticism, and that skepticism has served you well. It has allowed you to identify contradictions that others overlooked. It has given you tools to map distortions, but now you have reached the limit of what academic skepticism can achieve. The creature tilted its head. You've spent 5 years searching for answers in ancient texts. You found evidence of distortion, but you can't take the next step because the next step requires accepting that there are dimensions of reality that your academic training doesn't address, that there are forms of knowledge that don't fit into peer-reviewed papers. Edward felt the weight of those words. It was true. He had reached a dead end. He had all the evidence that something was wrong, but he couldn't grasp the full picture because he was missing pieces that simply didn't exist in conventional historical records. And if I accept this, he said slowly, if I allow this connection, what exactly will I see? You will see Jesus as he really was, not the sanitized and domesticated version that religions have created, but the real man, the revolutionary, the threat to systems of power. You will see what he really taught, not through translations filtered through centuries of distortion, but the original, unadulterated message, and you'll see what happened after he died. How religious and political leaders systematically rewrote the narrative, how they transformed a message of empowerment into a doctrine of dependency, how they used his death to reinstall exactly the kind of control he was trying to destroy. Edward felt goosebumps run down his arms. This was all exactly what he suspected, but suspecting and knowing were two very different things. And will this hurt me physically? No. You may experience temporary disorientation. You may experience intense emotions as you witness events, but there will be no physical harm. And mentally, the creature hesitated for a split second, and that hesitation told Edward everything. Mentally, it's up to you. Some truths are hard to bear, especially when they contradict deeply held beliefs. Some humans who see these things go into an existential crisis. They question everything. They struggle to reconcile what they know now with what they believed before. But you're already in this crisis, Edward. You're already questioning everything. The difference is that now you'll have answers instead of just doubts. Edward returned to his chair and sat down heavily. He looked at the manuscripts scattered across his desk. Years of work, years of solitude, years of searching for exactly this, and now it was being offered to him, but the price was trusting something that challenged his entire understanding of reality. If I do this, he said finally, if I let you show me these things, can I stop? If it's too much, if I can't handle it, can I stop? Yes, anytime. Just think, stop, and the connection will be broken immediately. Edward took several deep breaths. His hands were sweaty. His heart was racing. He thought of Martha. What she would say if she could see him now. She would probably scream that he had completely lost his mind, that this was final proof he had gone too far. But Martha wasn't there. No one was. It was just him, his manuscripts, and an impossible creature offering impossible answers. Okay, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Show me. Show me what really happened. He is sure. No, Edward admitted with a humorless laugh, but I'll do it anyway. The creature approached. Edward fought the urge to back away. Relax, breathe, and don't resist what you're about to see. Just observe, just absorb. Understanding will come. And then, the creature extended one of its long hands toward Edward's forehead. The creature's hand hovered inches from Edward's forehead. He could feel something emanating from it. Not heat exactly, but a kind of energy that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. "Wait," Edward said abruptly, backing up in his chair. "Wait, I need to think about this." He's scared. "Of course I'm scared." Edward stood up, backing away from the creature. "You're asking me to let you mess with my mind. How do I know you won't implant false things or control me?" "Edward, if I wanted to hurt or control you, I would have done so already. You've been in my presence for 20 minutes. I'm inside your home. If my intentions were hostile, you would already be vulnerable." It was cold logic, but valid. Edward hated to admit it, but it was true. "So, what's in it for you?" he asked. "Why come all the way here just to show me these things? Because the time has come, because your species is at a critical point, and because you need people who can see the truth and help others see it too." The creature turned to face him. "But first, you need to see clearly. You need to understand completely. Not just suspect or theorize, but know with absolute certainty." Edward was silent. Part of him screamed that this was madness, but another part, the part that had guided him through 5 years of obsessive research, knew he had to see. "Okay," he said finally, returning to his chair. "But slowly. If it gets too much, if I feel like it's doing something other than displaying memories, I'll stop." "Got it." Understood. The creature approached. The long hand reached out, and the delicate fingers lightly touched her forehead. The sensation was strange, as if something very gentle was connecting with something inside his skull. And then the world disappeared. Edward was no longer in his office. He was floating somewhere else, self-aware, but also in another dimension. "Don't fight it, just observe." And then the images began. He saw Earth from above, from space with impossible clarity. He saw clouds moving, oceans rippling. Memory. My memory of observing your planet. Keep observing. The perspective began to approach, diving through the atmosphere, descending until ancient Jerusalem. Edward was seeing the city as it was 2,000 years ago. Cobblestone streets, low buildings, people in ancient clothes, merchants, children, Roman guards. Everything was so vivid he could almost feel the heat, the smell of spices. And then he saw a man walking down the street. Average height, dark skin, dark hair, simple clothes. But there was something about him, something in the way he moved, how people reacted. Some backed away in fear, others approached with hope. Jesus. This was a real man, a Jew from Palestine, a carpenter, a rabbi, and a revolutionary. Edward watched, fascinated. Jesus stopped to talk to people, and something happened in their faces. Hope was kindled. Transformation began. He did not preach submission or unworthiness. He taught the exact opposite. The scene changed. Jesus was speaking to a smaller group. His gestures were passionate, and the people around him didn't look like passive worshippers. They looked like engaged, questioning students. He said the kingdom of God was within them, not in some distant temple within. He said they had divine power waiting to be activated, that they could do what he did, and more. Edward felt a deep sense of recognition. This corresponded to the apocryphal texts he had studied. The scene changed. Jesus was doing something extraordinary, healing a man who couldn't walk. The crowd erupted in joy. But in the background, Edward saw different faces, religious leaders, and their expressions were not of admiration. They were of fear, anger, threat. They saw Jesus doing impossible things, healing, multiplying food, demonstrating mastery over matter. And this terrified them because it seemed he had more power than they did. Edward saw heated discussions between leaders, nervous gestures, growing concern. But the truth was simple. Jesus was just connected, completely connected to the Father, to the Source, and he was trying to show that anyone could do the same. The scene showed Jesus speaking emphatically to disciples. "You will do greater works than these," he said repeatedly. It wasn't modesty. It was direct instruction. It was an invitation. I am the example, not the exception. Do as I do. Connect as I connect. But then the scene darkened. Edward saw secret meetings, religious leaders and authorities conspiring. If this man continues, he will have more influence than us. When people realize they can connect directly with God, without temples, without priests, without our mediation, all our power disappears. Edward felt sick. He was seeing the real motivation. It wasn't about theology. It was about power, about control. He saw the arrest, the sham trial, fabricated charges, the mob being manipulated by leaders who worked to ensure their desired outcome. They crucified Jesus because he threatened the system. Simple as that. He preached freedom, direct connection, personal empowerment. This would destroy all the institutional power they had. Edward saw the crucifixion. There was nothing glorious about it. It was brutal, horrible. A man being killed because he threatened power structures. It wasn't a planned, divine sacrifice. It was murder. Men with power killing men who threatened that power. And then the empty tomb. Edward saw disciples in shock. He saw Jesus appearing to them. Real, tangible, yet somehow transformed, demonstrating that consciousness transcends the physical body. They didn't expect it. But Jesus proved everything he said. He was resurrected, and now there was no denying it. He was the way, the truth, the life. The scene showed movement exploding, thousands converting, people abandoning traditional temples, seeking direct connection, and Edward saw religious leaders in panic. What they feared most was happening. But now they had a bigger problem. They couldn't kill the message. There were too many witnesses. The resurrection was a fact. So they did something much smarter. They decided to control the narrative. Edward saw meetings. Iflagtark, leaders emerging, Paul gaining influence, organizing, systematizing. If they couldn't eliminate the message, they would shape it, direct the interpretation. He saw texts being written, debates over which ones to include in the official scriptures, and the decisions weren't based on authenticity. They were based on political expediency. They began to reinterpret everything. Words about everyone being children of God were transformed into Jesus' exclusive claim. Teachings about inner power were softened into harmless metaphors. And then Edward saw the cruelest distortion of all. They took the crucifixion, the murder of a revolutionary who threatened the system, and turned it into a necessary sacrifice to pay for the sins of humanity. Jesus didn't die to save you from your sins. He died because he preached freedom and empowerment, because he taught that you didn't need external salvation, that you were already divine, that you were already children of God. But that message would destroy all institutional religious power, so they rewrote history. They turned his death into a tool of control. You are sinners. He died for you. Now you owe him. You owe obedience. You owe dependence. You must accept our authority as intermediaries. The scene accelerated. Centuries passed. The church grew in power and wealth. Doctrine was solidified. Questioners were silenced. They completely inverted the message. Jesus preached, "You are divine. You are powerful. You can do what I do." They turned it into, "You are unworthy. You are sinful. You need external salvation that only we can mediate." They used the death of humanity's greatest liberator to create the greatest mental prison in history, and they did it in his name. And then everything stopped. Edward was back. The creature's hand moved away. Tears streamed down her face. Her body trembled. Her breath came in gasps. And something inside him that had been trapped for 5 years finally broke free, because now he knew Jesus was real. The resurrection was real. He was the Son of God. And he tried to show that everyone is, but they killed him for it. And then they used that death to reinstall exactly the kind of control he was trying to destroy. Edward remained seated, his hands shaking violently, tears streaming uncontrollably. The creature had moved away, giving him space, but it remained there, watching silently. For several minutes, Edward couldn't speak. He couldn't move. He just processed. He tried to process the impossible, and then something inside him broke. "No," he said abruptly, standing up so fast the chair nearly toppled over. "No, no, no, this can't be right. It can't. Edward, no," he screamed, backing away from the creature. You're manipulating me. You're putting things in my head, implanting false memories." He pointed a trembling finger at the being. "I read about this, about how memories can be fabricated, how the brain can be tricked into believing things that never happened. You use some kind of alien technology to make my brain create these images. You know that's not it." "I don't know," Edward shouted, his voice cracking. I don't know anything. You show up in my backyard in the middle of the night. Show me. Show me impossible things and expect me to just accept it. He began to pace back and forth, his hands in his hair. This goes against everything. Everything. 2,000 years of Christianity. Billions of people, saints, martyrs, brilliant theologians. All of them wrong. All of them mistaken. This is absurd. It's hard to accept. Hard? Edward laughed hysterically. Hard? You're telling me that the entire basis of the Christian faith is an intentional distortion? That Jesus didn't die for our sins? That the crucifixion wasn't God's plan of salvation? He stopped, staring at the creature with wild eyes. You're telling me that the Catholic Church, which has existed for 2,000 years, which has shaped all of Western civilization, was built on a deliberate lie, not about a lie, about an inversion of truth, which is more dangerous. No. Edward shook his head violently. No, I can't accept that. My entire life, I've spent 20 years teaching religious studies, teaching that Jesus died to save us, that we were bought with a price, that he paid a debt we couldn't pay. Tears started again. If what you're saying is true, then I've spent 2 decades perpetuating the same distortion, teaching the same mental prison to hundreds of students. I'm part of the problem. You taught what was taught. You didn't know. But now I know, Edward cried. Now you've put this in my head and I can't get it out. I can't undo it. How do I live with this? He let himself fall to the floor, his back against the bookshelf. Martha was right. She was right about everything. I should have stopped. I should have accepted the conventional answers. I should have stayed ignorant and happy instead of… He gestured vaguely to the creature, instead of ending up here on the floor of my office having a mental breakdown. Talking to an alien who's telling me everything I've ever believed is false. It's not false, Edward. Jesus was real. Resurrection was real. Teachings were real. What's false is interpretation that was intentionally constructed to serve power rather than liberate people. And what's the difference? Edward asked bitterly. For billions of Christians around the world, there is no difference. The distorted version is their truth. It's their faith. It's what gives meaning to their lives. He looked up at the ceiling. And what do you want me to do with this information? Go around saying, hey guys, I found out the church lied for 2,000 years. Jesus didn't die for sins. You've been deceived. He gave another humorless laugh. They'll lock me up in a mental institution, or call me a heretic, or both. I've already lost my career by asking too many soft questions. Imagine if I started talking about it. So, you're going to pretend you didn't see it? Are you going to go back to your manuscripts and keep looking for evidence you've already found? Maybe, Edward said defensively. Maybe it's better this way. Living with suspicion is one thing. Living with certainty about something so destructive is entirely different. He got up unsteadily. You said that some people who see these truths go mad, that the weight is unbearable. Well, I'm beginning to understand why. Edward walked to the window, looking out into the darkness. I'm 60 years old. I'm alone. No career, no family. The only thing that keeps me going is the search for truth. And now you've given me truth that I can't use, I can't share, I can't prove. He turned to face the creature. Because who's going to believe it? Who's going to accept the word of a failed professor who says an alien appeared and showed telepathic visions about Jesus? You don't need to convince anyone, Edward. Then why did you show me? He asked, frustration and desperation in his voice. If I'm not supposed to do something with it, why burden me with this knowledge? Because truth has a power of its own. Because when you know something true, it changes how you see everything else, how you live, how you interact with the world. That's no answer, Edward said. That's vague philosophy. I need something concrete. I need purpose. I need a reason why it was worth losing everything. He pointed to the manuscripts on the table. 5 years. 5 years of studying, questioning, losing everything that mattered. And for what? To discover that I was right about distortion. But that truth is so disturbing I can't do anything about it. You can live it. Live? Edward echoed. How? How do I live knowing that billions of people worship a distorted version of Jesus? Knowing that the church that should liberate actually imprisons? The creature remained silent, letting Edward process his own anger and confusion. He walked back to the chair and sat down heavily. He covered his face with his hands. "I don't know if I can do this," he whispered. "I don't know if I can carry this knowledge. It's too heavy, too destructive. It's heavy because you're still fighting it, trying to deny it, trying to find a way to undo what you saw." Edward looked up, eyes red. "And wouldn't you do the same if your entire understanding of reality was turned upside down in one night?" "Yes, I understand. And that's why I'm being patient, because this is a natural reaction. Denial, anger, trying to return to the ignorance that was more comfortable." The creature took a step closer. "But you can't go back, Edward. You know that consciousness cannot be undone. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. You can only choose what you do with what you've seen." Edward was silent for a long time. The anger was beginning to dissipate, replaced by something heavier. Resignation, perhaps, or reluctant acceptance. "What if I choose nothing?" he asked quietly. "What if I just keep this? Live my life knowing but doing nothing? You can try, but you'll find that truth has a way of manifesting itself, of influencing your choices, of changing how you see and interact with the world, even when you're not consciously trying." Edward took several deep breaths, trying to calm himself. His body was still shaking, but less intensely now. "So, what do you want from me?" he asked, weariness deep in his voice. "Why are you really here? What's the point of all this? I want to show you the rest, because what you've seen so far is only part of the story. You've seen the problem, intentional distortion of the message, but you haven't seen the solution yet." Edward frowned. "Solution? Why this matters now. Why I am here now at this particular moment in human history. Why you and others like you are awakening to these truths simultaneously." The creature tilted its head. "There's a reason for all of this, Edward, but you need to be ready to listen. You need to stop fighting what you've already seen and let me show you the whole picture." Edward looked into those impossible eyes at the creature who had turned his world upside down in a single night. Part of him still wanted to run. He wanted to wake up and find out it was all a nightmare. But another part, the part that had driven him through 5 years of obsessive searching, that part knew he had to keep going, even if it destroyed him. "Okay," he said finally, his voice. Show me the rest. But after that, I need time. I need to process everything alone." "Agreed." Edward braced himself for another connection, for more impossible truths. But I wasn't prepared for what came next. Edward forced himself to sit up straighter in his chair, wiping his face with the back of his hands. His eyes were still red, but there was a growing determination in them now. If he was going to do this, if he was going to see the rest of it, then he had to do it now. "Before we continue," he said, his voice still shaky but firmer, "I need something concrete." The creature tilted its head. "What do you need? You showed me visions, memories. But how do I know they weren't just mental constructs? Images my own brain created based on what I already suspected." Edward stood up, walking over to the table full of manuscripts. "I'm an academic. I've been trained to question sources, to demand verifiable evidence. And what you gave me was subjective experience. Powerful, yes. Visceral, yes, but unverifiable. And what would be verifiable for you, Edward?" He picked up one of the notebooks, flipping through pages full of notes. "Show me something I don't know, something I couldn't possibly know, something specific in the texts I've studied that my conscious mind hasn't processed." Edward turned to face the creature. "If you really observed all this happen, if you really have direct knowledge of Jesus and the original texts, then show me something that proves it. Something I can verify later." The creature remained motionless for a moment, as if considering the request. "Okay, but not through telepathic connection this time, through something more tangible." The being approached Edward's desk, looking at the scattered manuscripts. His long fingers hovered over the pages without touching them. "You have a copy of the Gospel of Thomas there." Edward nodded. "I have Gnostic text. The church tried to erase it, but it survived in fragments and in the Nag Hammadi library. Turn to the said 77. Edward frowned, but obeyed, searching through his papers until he found the translation he had made from Coptic. He found the passage. Jesus said, "I am the light that is over them all. I am the everything. The everything went out of me, and the everything returned to me. Split the wood. There I am. Lift up the stone, and you will find me there." He looked up. "What about it? The translation you have is incomplete. There is a line that was purposely removed from the versions that reached you, a line that made the message too radical." Edward felt his heart race. What line between the all has returned to me and split the wood? There was another phrase. Jesus said, "And you are the all too. What I am, you are. Where I am, you are." Edward froze. That sentence, if it were real, completely changed the context of the passage. It wasn't just Jesus saying he was the light. It was him saying everyone was the light, that everyone was the everything. How do I check this?" he asked, skeptical but interested. "There is a fragment in Aramaic. It is not in the main collections. It is in a private archive in a monastery in Syria, or it was before the war. Now it is in the possession of a private collector in Istanbul who does not even know what he has." The creature continued, "The fragment has catalog number MS442TH. It was photographed once in 1967 by a researcher named Father Lucas Vance. The photo is in the archives of the Catholic University of Leuven, Belgium, rare manuscript section. It has never been digitized. No one paid attention to it because it was in deteriorated and poorly translatable Aramaic." Edward was taking notes frantically. Specific details, verifiable, or at least theoretically verifiable. And that sentence is there in that fragment. It is, and there is more. In the same fragment, there is a continuation of saying 77 that was also removed. Jesus explains, "Do not look for me outside, for you already live in me. Do not wait for me to return, for I never left. I am you when you wake up. I am I when you remember." Edward felt goosebumps run down his arms. This was exactly what the creature had shown in the visions. Jesus trying to say that he wasn't a unique exception, that everyone shared the same divine essence. "That's very specific," Edward said, still skeptical but less resistant. "Too specific to be coincidence or fabrication. There's more. You've been studying Paul's letters. Have you noticed contradictions between what Paul preaches and what Jesus taught?" "I noticed," Edward admitted. "Paul never met the living Jesus. His theology is different, more focused on sin, sacrifice, atonement. There was a letter written by James, the brother of Jesus, addressed to the early Christian communities, confronting Paul directly about these distortions, calling him a false apostle who was perverting his brother's message." Edward's eyes widened. Letter from James, confronting Paul. That would be explosive. Why have I never heard of it? Because it was systematically destroyed. Paul had more political influence, more connections with converted Roman leaders. When the confrontation became too public, too dangerous for the unity of the emerging movement, they decided to erase the evidence. But copies have survived. One is in fragments in the Vatican Secret Archive, catalogued as unauthenticated heretical correspondence. The creature paused. Another more complete copy was in the library of a Coptic monastery in Egypt. It was lost in a convenient fire in 1832, but a monk had made a partial transcription before that. The transcription is in the Coptic Museum in Cairo, incorrectly identified as an unidentified liturgical fragment. Edward was writing everything down, catalog numbers, locations, specific details that he could, in theory, verify. "Why are you giving me this?" he asked. "This specific information?" "Because you asked. Because you need something concrete to anchor what you saw, and because if you eventually get access to these documents, you'll find that every detail I gave you is correct." The creature moved away from the table. "But understand, this physical evidence will not convince the world. You can find these fragments. You can photograph them. You can translate them. And still, the religious establishment will dismiss them as apocryphal. They will question them. They will find ways to discredit them. Physical evidence only takes you so far. In the end, truth is not accepted because it is probable. It is accepted because it resonates, because something inside people recognizes it." Edward set his pen down. He looked at all the notes he just made. Numbers, locations. A trail of evidence that would take years to follow completely. But it was something. It was more than visions. It was verifiable. "Okay," he said slowly. "You've given me information I can investigate, that I can try to verify that helps." He took a deep breath. "But you said you'd show me the rest, the solution, why it matters now." "Try, then show me. Because if everything you said is true, if Jesus really was twisted like this, I need to understand why you're here now with me on this particular night." The creature approached again, but this time it didn't reach out for telepathic connection. Instead, it did something different. He raised one of his long hands, and his palm began to glow with a soft blue light. And in the air between them, they began to appear, not exactly holograms, but floating three-dimensional images, as if the creature were projecting thoughts directly into physical space. Edward leaned forward, fascinated. The image showed Earth, but it wasn't a static view. It was dynamic. He could see energy, waves of colored light pulsing around the planet. Some areas glowed brightly, others were darker. This is Earth as we see it, not just physically, but energetically. The collective consciousness of your species creates the field, and that field is changing. The light waves began to intensify in certain regions, with pulses of brightness appearing in different points around the globe. Thousands of years ago, the field was dominated by survival frequencies. Fear, tribalism, violence, low, dense frequencies. Jesus tried to raise the frequency, show the way to a more expanded consciousness, but the message was distorted, and humanity returned to old patterns. The waves darkened in the projection, becoming denser, heavier. For 2,000 years, frequency remained low, controlled by systems based on fear, separation, domination, religions that preached indignity, governments that maintained power through division, economics based on scarcity. But then, something changed in the projection. Small points of light began to appear. Scattered, random at first, then more frequent. But in the last few decades, something has started to change. People have started to wake up. They have started to question. They have started to seek deeper truths. They have started to reject old systems. The points of light multiplied in the projection, thousands of them, then millions, spread across the entire planet. And now, Edward, now your species is at a tipping point. It is about to reach a critical mass of awakened consciousness, and when that happens, everything changes. Edward watched, mesmerized. The lights pulsed faster and faster. They began to connect, forming a luminous network around the planet. "Critical mass," he whispered. "What does that mean?" "It means that when enough humans awaken to the truth about who they really are, the power they truly have, the divinity within, the collective frequency shifts, and when the frequency shifts, systems based on lies and control can no longer sustain themselves. They just collapse." And in the projection, Edward saw exactly that. Dark structures holding low frequencies began to break apart, dissolving into the growing light. His breath caught in his throat. Because I was actually seeing what the creature had been trying to explain, and it was much bigger than he imagined. Edward remained seated, his eyes fixed on the luminous projection floating in the air, the waves of light pulsing around the earth, the points of consciousness awakening, the network forming. It was beautiful and terrifying. "You keep talking about awakening," Edward said finally, his voice low, "about people questioning, about consciousness changing. But what does that mean in practice?" The projection began to slowly dissolve, the lights fading until it disappeared completely. The creature lowered its hand. "It means that people around the planet are having experiences similar to yours. Not necessarily encounters like this, but awakenings, moments where veils fall and deeper truths are revealed." Edward stood, walking to the window. Outside, the night was still dark. Everything seemed normal, silent, as it always was. "But I don't see that," he said. "I see a world full of division, of hate, of people increasingly trapped in ideological bubbles. Religions still control billions. Systems of power seem stronger than ever. That's what it looks like on the surface. But look deeper." Edward turned to face the creature. "What do you mean? Why do you think systems are becoming more extreme, more desperate in their methods of control, more aggressive in silencing dissenting voices?" Edward frowned, thinking. Because they feel threatened. Because a growing number of people are no longer accepting old narratives. They are no longer automatically bowing to religious authorities. They are no longer finding satisfaction in doctrines that preach limitation and unworthiness. The creature moved closer to the window, standing next to Edward. When the system is secure in its power, it doesn't need to be violent. It doesn't need to be desperate. But when the system feels it's losing control, it reacts. It tries to tighten its grip even more, and that creates even greater resistance. Edward thought about the past few years, the growing divisions, the religious extremism, the culture wars. It felt like chaos. But could it be a sign of a system collapsing rather than strengthening? So you're saying that all of this, the chaos, the divisions, is actually good. Is it a sign of change happening? I wouldn't say good, I'd say necessary. The pain of childbirth, Edward. There's always chaos before birth. There's always desperate resistance from old structures before new ones can emerge. Edward returned to his chair, sitting down heavily. His mind was still spinning, trying to process everything. But even if all of this is true, even if people are waking up, what does that have to do with me? Why are you here in this house talking to me specifically? Because you're one of the catalysts, Edward. He gave a bitter laugh. Catalyst? I'm a failed professor who lives alone, surrounded by manuscripts. I have no influence. I have no platform. I have nothing. You have something more important than all this. What? You have truth. And you have the courage to carry the truth even when it costs everything. That's rare, Edward. Rarer than you know. The creature inclined its head in that gesture. Edward now recognized. Most people, when confronted with truth that threatens their fundamental beliefs, choose the comfort of lies. They choose safe ignorance over disturbing knowledge, but you didn't. You kept searching even when it cost you your marriage, your career, your reputation. What has that brought me? Edward asked, bitterness clear in his voice. Loneliness, isolation, sleepless nights. And now this. He gestured vaguely to the creature. Knowledge I cannot use. Truth I cannot share. Weight I cannot carry. You can carry. You're carrying right now. And as for sharing, the creature paused. You don't have to shout truth from the mountaintops. You don't have to convince the masses. You just have to live it. Embody it. Allow it to transform how you exist in the world. That's too vague, Edward said, frustration rising again. I need something concrete, something I can do. Then let me be specific. The creature sat down in one of the other chairs in the office, a movement so human that for a moment Edward forgot he was speaking to an otherworldly being. You will continue your research, but not just as an academic pursuit. As preparation, you will organize what you have discovered. Evidence of distortion, patterns of alteration, Jesus' original message versus constructed interpretation. And it will be shared not through academic papers that will be rejected by journals, but through means that reach ordinary people, people who are questioning, seeking, ready to listen. Edward frowned. What do you mean? You want me to what? Write a book? Start a blog? That sounds like small, insignificant. Try. A single stone sends ripples across an entire lake. Edward, you don't have to change the world alone. You just have to add your voice to the growing chorus of voices that are saying, something is wrong, we've been deceived, there's a deeper truth waiting to be discovered. The creature leaned forward slightly. And most importantly, you will live differently. You will stop seeking external approval. You will stop carrying guilt that is not yours. You will recognize that you, just as Jesus tried to teach, have inner divinity. You have a direct connection to the source. You don't need mediators. You don't need external salvation. You say it as if it were simple, Edward said. But decades of conditioning don't disappear overnight. They don't disappear. They are deconstructed step by step, day by day, choice by choice. Edward was silent for a long moment, processing. You said there are others, he finally spoke. Others, like me, awakening, questioning. You visit them all like this. Not all, not this way. There are many paths to awakening. Some have spontaneous experiences. Others find human teachers who guide them. Others simply know. One day they wake up, and the truth is clear. But some, a few, need more direct intervention because they have specific roles, because their awakenings will create ripples that reach many others. And I'm one of those few. Try. Why? Why am I special? You are not special, Edward. You are necessary. There is a difference. Special implies superiority. Necessary implies the right position, at the right time, with the right preparation. The creature gestured to the surrounding manuscripts. You spent 5 years doing work that most people wouldn't have the patience or courage to do. You mapped distortions. You identified patterns. You built an evidence base. Now you're ready for the next step. What next step? To understand not just what was distorted, but why the original was so powerful. Why? Jesus' real message, if understood and lived, would transform everything. Edward felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear this time. Something different. Anticipation, perhaps. Then show me, he said. Show me the real message, what Jesus really meant, how it was supposed to be lived. Not through more visions, through understanding. I will explain, and you will feel the resonance of truth. Are you ready? Edward took a deep breath. He thought about everything he had seen so far, everything he had lost, everything he was gaining, and he nodded. I'm ready. The creature was silent for a moment, as if choosing words carefully, and then it began. Jesus taught 3 fundamental things that have been completely distorted or removed. First, you are not separate from God. You are extensions of God. When he said, I and the Father are one, he was not claiming exclusivity. He was declaring reality available to everyone. Edward listened intently. Second, the kingdom of God is not a future or external place. It is a state of consciousness. It is within you, accessible now, in this moment, when you choose to operate on a frequency of love, unity, compassion, and third, the most dangerous to power structures. You have the very potential that Jesus demonstrated. You will do greater works was not vague encouragement. It was literal instruction. Connection to Source allows you to transcend limitations that you believe are absolute. The creature paused. These 3 truths, if understood and lived, make all religious institutions obsolete. Because if you are not separated from God, you don't need a mediator. If the kingdom is within, you don't need an external authority telling you how to reach it. If you truly have Jesus' potential, you don't need to worship him as distant and unattainable. You need to follow his example and become like him. Edward felt tears burn again. But they weren't tears of despair this time. They were for recognition because something inside him, something that had been whispering for 5 years of research, was finally hearing clear confirmation. That's why they distorted it, he whispered. Because the real message would destroy all their power. Yes, and that is why now when humanity is ready to listen again, truth is resurfacing through you, through thousands like you. Not to destroy religion for the sake of destroying, but to free people from the mental prisons that religion has become. Edward wiped his face, straightened his shoulders. For the first time since the creature appeared, he felt no fear. I felt purpose. The weeks that followed that night were the strangest and most transformative of Edward Thorne's life. The creature had departed shortly before dawn. There was no dramatic farewell, just one last message that echoed in his mind as the being walked toward that impossible structure in the backyard. Remember, Edward, you don't have to convince anyone. Just live the truth. Share what you've discovered with those who have ears to hear. And trust that something much bigger is happening than you can see. And then the structure just wasn't there anymore. Edward stood on the porch for a long time, watching the sky lighten. Part of him still wondered if it had all been an elaborate hallucination, a mental breakdown after years of isolation and obsession. But when he returned to his office and saw his new notes, the cataloging numbers, the specific locations, the details about texts he had never heard of, he knew he hadn't imagined it. Something impossible had happened. And now, he had to decide what to do with it. For the first few days, Edward did nothing. He just sat with the knowledge. He let it sink in. He processed it. He revisited his manuscripts with completely new eyes. Passages I'd read hundreds of times suddenly revealed layers I'd never seen before. Distortions he'd suspected were now obvious. Patterns of alteration leaped from the pages. But something else was going on. Edward noticed he was sleeping better. The sleepless nights that had plagued him for years began to lessen, not because his problems disappeared, but because something inside him had relaxed, let go. The guilt he'd been carrying about the divorce, about his lost career, about wasted years, began to dissolve. He understood now that he hadn't wasted anything. He'd been following the path he needed to follow, making the necessary preparations, and the loneliness he'd always felt. That sense of being fundamentally separate, disconnected, alone, began to change as well. Not because someone else had appeared in his life, but because he began to feel connection to something greater, to the source the creature had spoken of. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't visions or voices. It was more subtle, like a constant presence, like knowing he wasn't truly alone. He never was. One morning, about 2 weeks after that night, Edward was making coffee when he suddenly stopped in mid-motion. He realized he was smiling, not because something funny had happened, not because he received good news, just smiling, feeling spontaneous gratitude for being alive, for being able to breathe, for being aware. And that simple moment, so different from the years of heaviness and darkness, made him realize that something fundamental had shifted within him. Edward began to write. Not an academic paper, not something to submit to journals that would reject it anyway, but something different, something accessible, something that ordinary people questioning their own religious beliefs, could find and recognize. He created a simple blog called Lost Texts, Found Truths, and started sharing. Not the visions the creature showed, those he kept to himself, knowing no one would believe, but the evidence he had compiled over 5 years, the contradictions in the texts, the patterns of alteration, the glaring differences between the original message and the constructed interpretation. He wrote clearly, accessibly, without excessive academic jargon, as if he were talking to a curious friend instead of presenting to a panel of professors. At first, no one read it. The blog had 0 visitors other than himself, but Edward continued. He posted regularly. He shared his discoveries. He made connections between different texts. He showed how a message of empowerment was transformed into a doctrine of dependency. And slowly, very slowly, people began to appear. At first, there were few occasional comments from people expressing gratitude, saying they'd always felt something was wrong, but couldn't put their finger on it, saying they finally had the language to name their doubts. Then more and more. Within 3 months, the blog had thousands of regular readers, people from all over the world. Some were still Christians, but questioning. Others had left Christianity but were still seeking spiritual truth. Others had never been religious but felt the official story didn't make sense. Edward received emails, messages, people sharing their own awakening journeys, their own discoveries about distortions. And he realized something extraordinary. He was not alone. The creature was right. There were thousands, perhaps millions of people around the planet going through similar processes, questioning, awakening, seeking deeper truth, and each one that awakened touched others. It created waves exactly as the creature had shown in that luminous projection. 6 months after that impossible night, something unexpected happened. Martha called. Edward almost didn't answer when he saw her name on the screen. They hadn't spoken in over a year. Ever since the divorce was finalized, she made it clear she wanted no further contact. But something made him answer. Edward. Her voice sounded different, less tense, less angry. Martha. Hey. There was an uncomfortable pause. I saw your blog, she said finally. Edward felt his stomach tighten. Oh. I don't know how I found it. I was researching something completely different and it came up and I recognized your writing style, so I started reading. Another pause. Edward, I need to apologize to you. He blinked in surprise. Apology? Why? For saying you were obsessed, that you were wasting your life, that you were going crazy. Her voice trembled slightly. I read everything you posted, and Edward, you were right about the distortions, about the contradictions, about everything. I didn't want to see it because it was too scary, because it meant questioning everything I'd been taught. Edward felt something tighten in his chest. Not anger, not bitterness, just compassion. "Martha, you don't need to apologize. You were protecting your beliefs. That's natural. But I hurt you in the process. I pushed you away when you needed support the most. And now, I'm going through what you went through, questioning everything, feeling like the ground is disappearing from under my feet." She took a deep breath, and I thought maybe we could talk. Not about getting back together or anything, but just talking because you understand this in a way that no one else in my life does. Edward smiled, feeling warmth in his chest that he hadn't expected to feel. "Sure, Martha, we can talk anytime." And as they talked, really talked, for the first time in years, Edward understood something profound. It wasn't about proving he was right. It wasn't about Martha admitting she was wrong. It was about connection, about sharing truth in a way that allowed others to recognize it in their own time without forcing, without judgment. It was exactly what the creature had tried to explain. A year after that night, Edward sat in his office, the same office, surrounded by the same manuscripts, but everything was different. The blog had grown beyond his expectations. Tens of thousands of readers, podcast invites, people wanting him to write a book. But more important than numbers, he received messages almost daily from people saying something had clicked, that they finally understood, that they were breaking free from mental prisons they'd carried for decades. Each message was a reminder that the creature was right. He didn't need to change the world alone. He just needed to add his voice, live his truth, and trust that the waves would reach those who needed to be reached. Edward also noticed deeper changes in himself. He woke up with genuine gratitude. Not because life was perfect. He was still alone, still had bills to pay, still faced challenges, but because he understood something fundamental. He was not a victim of circumstances. He was not an unworthy sinner in need of external salvation. He was not small and powerless waiting for a distant God to decide his fate. He was, as Jesus had tried to teach, an extension of the source. He had inner divinity. He had the power to create, transform, transcend. And that understanding changed everything. Not magically, not instantly, but gradually, deeply, undeniably. One night, exactly a year after their encounter, Edward stood on his porch stargazing. He thought about the creature, how it had traveled impossible distances to plant a seed of understanding, and he wondered if she was up there watching, seeing what that seed had germinated into. As if in response, he felt something. Not a voice, not a physical presence, but something like gentle confirmation, as if the universe were saying, "Yes, we see, we celebrate, keep going." Edward smiled at the stars. He didn't know what the future would bring. He didn't know if critical mass would be reached in his lifetime. He didn't know if humanity would truly free itself from the distortions of 2,000 years. But he knew he was doing his part. Living the truth, he discovered, sharing it with those ready to listen, being an example that liberation was possible. And maybe, just maybe, when enough people did the same, the real return of Christ consciousness would happen. Not Jesus coming down from the clouds to passively save, but humanity collectively awakening to the inner divinity that Jesus tried to show. And that understanding, that simple yet profound truth, made all the difference. Edward returned to the office. He had more research to do, more articles to write, more people to reach. But now he did everything with a lightness he never had before, because he understood he was not alone in this mission. There were thousands like him, awakening, questioning, liberating, and together, person by person, heart by heart, they were changing the frequency of the entire planet. The creature was right about everything. And Edward Thorne, a 60-year-old former failed teacher, was part of something much bigger than he ever imagined. Edward's journey reveals something profound and disturbing. What if you've spent your entire life believing a distorted version of the truth? What if the most revolutionary and liberating message in human history has been systematically turned into a tool of control? Edward was an academic, a respected professor, a man of faith, and he lost everything because he couldn't stop asking questions no one wanted to hear. He discovered that Jesus didn't preach unworthiness. He preached internal divinity. He didn't teach dependence on external salvation. He taught personal empowerment and a direct connection to Source. And for that he was crucified, not as a divine sacrifice, but because it threatened power structures. And then they did something even more cruel. They took that death and turned it into the basis of a doctrine that preaches the exact opposite of what he taught. They turned the message of, "You are powerful, you are divine, you create your own reality," into, "You are powerless, you are sinful, you need others to save you." And this inversion has kept billions of people trapped for 2,000 years, trapped in guilt, in fear, in the belief that they are victims of circumstance. And maybe you are one of those people. Perhaps you've spent years feeling that life is simply bad for you, that you have no control, that you're a victim of external forces, fate, luck, the will of a distant God who arbitrarily decides who suffers and who prospers. But what if that's a lie? What if Jesus was trying to teach the exact opposite? That you are not a victim, that you are not powerless, that you create your reality through your thoughts, your emotions, your beliefs, your choices. When Jesus healed instantly, he wasn't performing magic. He was demonstrating that consciousness dominates matter. When he said, "Your faith has healed you," it wasn't a figure of speech. It was a literal instruction. What you deeply believe, what you feel intensely creates your experience. But these truths were too dangerous because if people understood that they create their own realities through thoughts and emotions, that they are not victims but creators, the entire system of control would crumble. How can you control someone who knows they have the inner power to transform circumstances it cannot? So they distorted it. They transformed teachings about personal responsibility and creative power into a doctrine of victimhood and powerlessness. And Edward discovered this in the most impossible way through an encounter that defies all logic. But you don't need an alien visit to see the truth. You just need to take an honest look at your own life. Look at repeating patterns. Look at how your dominant thoughts create your dominant experiences. Look at how when you change internally, externally you change too. Not by magic, but because you're operating on a different frequency that attracts corresponding experiences. Jesus taught this constantly. As you believe, so it will be done to you. Ask, and you will receive. The kingdom of God is within you, not in the distant heavens, but within. Accessible when you align thoughts, emotions, and beliefs with frequencies of love, gratitude, and peace. But these truths were buried, softened, transformed into pretty but harmless metaphors. Because the real truth sets you free, and free people cannot be controlled. Now, here's what Edward discovered. When you stop being a victim and recognize that you are a creator, when you stop waiting for salvation and start accessing the power within, everything changes. Not instantly, not magically, but inevitably. And this transformation is not just personal, it is collective. Because when you awaken, your frequency changes, and this changed frequency affects everyone around you. Edward isn't special. He doesn't have unique gifts. He's just a person who had the courage to question. And if he can do it, so can you. But you have to choose. Choose to stop being a victim and recognize that you are a creator. Choose to stop waiting for external salvation and awaken inner power. Choosing to stop living in a frequency of fear, guilt, and limitation, and start operating in a frequency of love, gratitude, and unlimited possibility. Because here is the truth they tried to bury for 2,000 years. You are not small. You are not unworthy. You are not powerless. You are the image and likeness of the Creator. And when enough people wake up to this, when a critical mass recognizes inner power rather than seeking external salvation, everything changes. Not through violent revolution, but through a silent transformation of consciousness, person by person, heart by heart, until the collective frequency of the entire planet rises. And systems based on control, fear, and victimhood simply can no longer sustain themselves at this heightened frequency. They collapse naturally. So I ask, are you ready? Ready to stop being a victim and recognize that you are a creator? Ready to take full responsibility for your reality instead of blaming others? Ready to awaken to the power that Jesus tried to show, but that was buried under layers of intentional distortion? If anything in this story resonated with you, if something sparked deep recognition, if something made you question narratives you've always accepted, leave it in the comments. Share your feelings, your own awakening experiences, moments when you realize that thoughts and emotions truly shape reality. Because every person who opens to the deeper truth shifts the collective frequency. Each individual awakening contributes to the collective awakening that is happening now in this moment around the entire planet. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell for more stories that challenge accepted narratives and invite you to recognize the power you've always had but were taught to deny. And remember, you don't have to believe in aliens. You don't have to accept every detail of this story literally, but you need to be willing to question. Now, the truth is resurfacing. The question is, will you recognize her?